Hello Year 10, welcome to this week's Sign of 4 revision. This week we'll be exploring other characters. They are characters who do not fit into society or within the British Empire. The characters who represent this idea of otherness are Thaddeus Sholto, Tonga and the Sikhs from India. As always, there's a recall quiz included. Take a look at the questions, note down your answers A, B and C for these 5, and later in the presentation you can check your answers and check that your knowledge is correct. On this slide I want to draw your attention to the assessment objectives so that we can recap exactly what is required for A01, A02 and A03. A01 is the understanding of the text, the interpretation of the writer's ideas and your use of quotations. A02 is your analysis of the methods and A03 is context. Remember, in every answer you will be required to use A01, A02 and A03, with A01 being the driving force behind your response. Now, to really understand the topic of others and the British Empire, we need to take a look at some key contextual information. By 1890, when the novella was written, Britain ruled large parts of the globe. As you can see from the map included, anywhere that is orange was under the ruling of the British and the British Empire. The British Empire ruled through the power of politics, so by the Queen, and it was governed by Britain with the same rules as us, but they also gained power through trade. The areas that were not under British Empire or rule were often feared and disrespected and judged as being less worthy or less advanced than those belonging to Britain. By the end of the 19th century, the British Empire had become the largest empire known in history, so anything that was not part of the British Empire was deemed as being less worthy. Now, many of the fears of others or racism in Britain was born as a direct result of this British Empire and this sense of us and them. And a lot of the tales that were told from the colonisation expeditions were actually brought back to Britain and also further fueled the fears of the others and people from other parts of the world. Now, India was a part of the British Empire and ruled by Britain. But in 1857 there was a rebellion. This is where some of the Indians did not want to be held under British power any longer, and they wanted to regain their country as their own, and they fought against the Britons that were there in their country. However, some Indians were quite happy with having the British there and being part of the British Empire, and they actually fought to defend the British. This rebellion, which had some of the Indians fighting against Britain, some fighting for Britain, led to a rebellious war which went on for 2 years. The rebellion was not declared over until 1859, so for 2 years tales were coming back to Britain about the war that was going on overseas. Now, Britain did manage to maintain its control in India and they actually won the rebellion. However, it did pose a great risk to Britain and the power that it had, and many Victorians still living in England built up this fear of others from across the world, because they knew that at any moment other countries could rise up against Britain and fight back, as the Indians had done, because once the country was quite calm and happy to have Britain there, but in the blink of an eye everything changed. So one of the fears that the Victorians had was that if all of the British Empire fought back at the same time, Britain would probably lose power completely. So whilst those in the British Empire were accepted as being part of Britain, they were never fully trusted or accepted as being equal to those in Britain. Now the first point that can be made about the theme of others is the fact that Conan Doyle, throughout his novella, actually presents foreigners or others who belong to part of the British Empire as being loyal. Now we know that in 1890 there were racist views in England, but those who were part of the British Empire that actually defended Britain and wanted to be there were actually presented as having some positive qualities and were not as feared as other people from around the globe who did not want to be under British rule. In order to prove this throughout the novel, we would look at how Major Sholto describes his servant from India, Lal Chowdhury. Now, when talking about Lal Chowdhury, he describes him as my faithful old Lal Chowdhury. The possessive pronoun my shows that Sholto did feel a sense of ownership over Lal Chowdhury, mainly due to Britain ruling India at the time, and that idea that he had of the British man being more powerful than the Indian man. So this sense of control that Britain had across the globe then extended to how the British people treated people from elsewhere, and this is kind of where that racist idea began. So whilst he kind of feels like he owns him, he still sees positive in him. He describes him as being faithful with the adjective faithful, but he also uses the adjective loyal later on as well. So whilst Chowdhury is enslaved and is still who's his servant, he is appreciated as being faithful and loyal. So it's clear that he's seen as an object, but a valuable object that we can appreciate rather than a valuable object to fear and despise. Now, this is very different to some characters from elsewhere around the world who were not quite so happy to be under Britain's rule. Another way that Doyle presents the others who belong to the British Empire was by giving them a voice through the southern writer Sholto. In the dialogue between Chowdhury and Sholto, Chowdhury states that my lips are sealed when he fears that Sholto may have murdered Captain Morstan. By saying my lips are sealed, he is using a metaphor. This metaphor shows the loyalty that Chowdhury was capable of demonstrating to his owner as he was his servant. By creating the image of sealed lips, we see him again as almost inhuman, because sealing lips is impossible, it's metaphorical. So again it kind of creates this idea of him being more of an object than a person. So whilst it's actually a positive image that Lal Chowdhury is able to seal his lips, the language used again by himself also shows how he felt that in some ways he weren't treated as a proper human or equal to the people that were around him. So it's clear that whilst Doyle does not directly give them a voice, they are allowed to be heard, which in many ways is much better than how some of the other characters are treated. We can see that characters that are in favour of the British Empire are seen as being useful for society and can be depended upon when needed. And that's why they're treated more favourably, but they're not given equality in comparison to other characters, for example the white British characters. And whilst at the moment this seems awful, we see in a minute how Doyle uses this image and then challenges it in order to make people consider their racist views in Victorian Britain. Similarly, Jonathan Small also talks about the Sikhs, who he builds a sign of fall with, and who are also part of the British Empire, in the same way as Sholto did. He also presents them as loyal individuals. When discussing a sign of fall, he states that they are in with me and we all go together. The inclusive pronoun we, which he uses throughout this novella, creates a sense of togetherness and unity between the British man and these other characters, who society would have ordinarily feared based on the colour of their skin, but due to their position within the empire, they are shown as loyal individuals by all who encounter them. The Sholto family also present them in positive, and so does Jonathan Small. So it's very clear that the British Empire had great power over how people were seen in society, and that racism wasn't as governed by the colour of skin as it was to how much a person pledged allegiance to the British Empire and British rule. Now, the second point that you need to consider when discussing the other characters is actually, as we've just said, those that are part of the British Empire and who are happy to be part of the British Empire are presented quite favourably, but those who are against British control are the most disliked characters. So anyone that fought against Britain's control were presented as being almost frightening animals or something for society to fear. We see this when we see how the other Indians who were involved in the uprising against Britain's rules are presented. Jonathan Small describes them from his experiences in India as fiends, black devils. He describes the country as a hell. He talks about them howling and behaving like a swarm of bees. Now, as you will see, there's a recurring image of hell running throughout this with the words devil and hell. But there's also language linked to animals with howling and bees. Again, by keep repeating these images, we see how they were presented as almost being less human because they didn't want to join in with British rule. And a lot of this presentation of people is governed by whether Britain was able to control them and to own them. So what Conan Doyle's kind of showing is that race itself and the colour of someone's skin is not necessarily the issue, but it's whether they were allowed themselves to be controlled by the British Empire. Doyle, by presenting them two different presentations of the Indian people, kind of shows in some ways the injustices of the racism, because some were loyal and trusted and others weren't, and were all feared on sight. So it raises some questions as to whether racism is valid, or actually whether it is a tool that British people used to control the world. And hopefully you'll understand that Doyle's saying it's not valid and it was wrong. Now, the third key point that you would make is that the uncolonised parts of the world actually held the greatest fear for Victorians, because it really developed their fear of the unknown. Now, the character that kind of symbolises this terror of the unknown is Tonga. Now, various characters see Tonga and they all describe him in the same way. Thaddeus repeats the adjective wild when describing Tonga's appearance. Sherlock reads from his encyclopedia and repeats the adjective fierce when describing Tonga's tribesmen. Watson described him as a savage and a creature and he says that he chattered at us with half animal fury. He uses the verb gnashing and the adjective venomous. And Small uses language linked to evil and animals by using the metaphor little hellhound and little devil. Now, all the characters we've seen him or encountered him use this imagery of animals or dangerous animals. So we've got like gnashing and venomous, and animal fury, savage, creature, wild. All the language reduces him to less than a man and more of an animal. And this is where we can see again that racism developed as a result of the fear that if it wasn't known by Britain, it was something to be scared of. And this is kind of where everything developed, and Tonga kind of shows that fear symbolically. As I've just mentioned, another thing that's important is the way that Tonga dies in the novella. His death has great symbolic significance. He actually dies in the River Thames and is left to sink with no proper burial. Now, throughout the novella, nobody other than Small actually hears him speak or looks beyond his appearance, and yet, based on his appearance, everyone that encounters him is utterly terrified. Maybe, with Doyle having him die on the outskirts of London, he's actually showing how he would never have been accepted by society with the views that they currently held. He's not allowed to actually die on land. He never gets to be part of London properly. This lack of respect that his body is shown as it dies in the water and is left to sink also supports this idea of him being dehumanised as nothing more than a creature. With Victorian society having faith, the burial of a body would be really important in allowing that body to then go to the afterlife. So by refusing to drag him out of the water kind of shows the utter disrespect that people had towards Tonga. Now, this is quite like a sad end for any human being, but it's done on purpose so that in a minute when Jonathan Small's narrative is given and we learn more about the character Tonga, there's a greater juxtaposition, so we see how awful the awful treatment that he had, and then we realise that how absolutely undeserving it probably was, and this tragic end is given more sympathy by the fact that he is just allowed to kind of sink. Now, maybe Conan Doyle is kind of doing this so that his more woke readers, or those who are more aware of some of the injustices in the world, are actually able to see how wrong that is. Now, this in many ways is the most important point that you would make when talking about others. We've talked about the fact that anyone that wasn't under the British Empire or British rule was seen very negatively and seen as being something to fear, almost with that mentality that, well, if you don't want to be part of Britain, you must be something of utter terror and we must stay away from you and hate you. And we've talked about those that do want to be under British rule as seen much more positively, but actually towards the end this is where Doyle kind of teaches his message, teaches us a lesson and shares his message about why he presents the others in the way that he has. At the very end of the novella ends with Jonathan Small's narrative, which is most of chapter 12. This is when Jonathan Small gets to tell us the truth about the character Tonga, and his experience of him as a man. He tells us his experience of the Sikh people and how they treated him, and a lot of the messages are unravelled here. Tonga is never allowed his own voice, but we hear his voice through Jonathan Small. Now, Small uses language linked to friendship. Now, he calls him a mate and a chum, and they're two important words to learn. He also uses the adjectives faithful and true, and says that Tonga was devoted and that he would do anything to be able to serve. So we've got these words now that massively contradict the earlier presentation of him being a hell. found an animal. We've now got a man who's capable of forming friendships and showing loyalty and devotion, which are very complex and very disciplined human emotions and behaviours. So what we're left with at the end of the novel are two totally juxtaposing narratives. The first set of him being an animal and being linked to hell are based on appearance only. It's based on nothing other than what he looks like. The last narrative, which is told by John Small, is based on him as a man and from someone who knows him and got to know him over time. Also at the end, for the first time, Tonga is humanised, so he's described as being a fine boatsman, but it's the boatman that's important because it's the first time he's referred to as being a man, someone with a profession and skill, as opposed to just an animal. Now, one of the reasons Doyle might have done this is to actually challenge readers to see how leading with or judging people based on first impression is actually wrong. He's maybe subtly saying that there's a lot more to people than we believe, that our fears are ungoverned and unfounded, but it's definitely not accidental. So it's important for you to consider why at the end do we actually feel sympathy for Tonga. Now, if you're really trying to stretch your responses, you will talk about the fact that whilst Jonathan Small shows us this sympathetic view of Tonga is never accepted within London society, and we get that with the fact that he is killed on the I suppose the edge of London society in the River Thames. He's not given a burial and he's left to kind of like float off into the water. So this kind of shows the exclusion of Tonga and the fact that he's never really treated or would never be allowed to be treated, and that adds to that sympathy that Conan Doyle is really trying to create. Now, as we just explained, Doyle includes quite a revolutionary idea for his time, that actually people from far places of the world who are not under British Empire are not people to be feared. Now, at the time when Victorian fear was quite high, this would be quite a brave idea to put forward. It would have been quite different for a writer to have seen other races in such a way. So Doyle has to be very careful to put this revolutionary idea in a subtle way that if readers want to, they can discredit it and it doesn't actually make the narrative too unbelievable. So what he does is he allows readers who want to think an opportunity to kind of consider what Doyle might be suggesting, but he also gives readers who are much more traditional a way out. Now, he's very careful in ensuring that the only character who talks positively about Tonga is Jonathan Small, who could quite easily be discredited because he's a criminal who's spent many years overseas, so maybe that would suggest that he's unreliable or that he's kind of no longer seeing things the British way. But what he does do is very interesting, because whilst there's a way out of believing that Tonga is more than people originally thought he was, Conan Doyle actually, when Jonathan Small's finished his whole narrative, he has Sherlock Holmes agree with Small's viewpoint. At the end, after chapter 12, when Small finishes talking, Sherlock Holmes said, "I'd have done the same thing." Now, whilst he's not talking about Tonga specifically, he is agreeing with Jonathan Small's decisions and opinions on the situation. So what Conan Doyle does is he makes the main protagonist, Sherlock Holmes, side with this final sub-narrator, supporting Jonathan Small. So what this kind of does is it raises our respect towards Jonathan Small, and if we respect him a little bit more, maybe then his opinions on other people and other characters are something that we should respect too. So Conan Doyle is very clever in giving people who want to consider alternative viewpoints a bit of validation that their viewpoint is something that's worth considering, but he also gives other readers a way out of it. So he challenges stereotypes and judgments that were wrong in Victorian society, but in a way that still leaves him as a credible writer. Now, in order to really get to grips with the final point that we will discuss with the way others are treated in society, we need to just recap quickly Cesare Lombroso's theory. Now, this was mentioned in last week's PowerPoint, and we talked about it with regards to criminals, but just remind ourselves, exactly what he theorised. He stated that most criminals were born with identifiable features, and some of those features were red hair, high foreheads, pendulous lips. The aim of the study would be to provide security to people that actually criminals can be kind of found easier. But the problem with this is that anyone that is unfortunate enough to be born with these features would quite often be wrongly implicated in crimes that they had not committed. And we see that with Thaddeus Sholto, who is a gentleman, a kind man, but because of the unfortunate combination of his physical features, he's treated with fear in society. So just remind ourselves that whilst Thaddeus is not necessarily an other with regards to race, he is because his features are also judged the same way that someone from different parts of the world were judged on appearance only. So Thaddeus' character is very important to Doyle because it's through a character like Thaddeus that he's able to raise concerns about the way society judged individuals. The final point that's important to consider when looking at others is that appearances should not be actually what we fear, and we should not use our appearances or the appearance of others to form our judgments. We see this with the characterisation of the Sholto twins, and this idea can be extended to race as well, because it is all about appearance. Both identical twins have identical features, but their personalities are completely different, which kind of proves the point that appearances do not have any correlation to your personality and behaviours, because these two men have the same appearance but very different behaviours. If this is kind of true, that appearances don't link to our behaviours, then the same can be said about people of race as well, that their appearance does not link to their behaviours. So not only does he prove this point with the characters from across the world, so for example Tonga and the Indians, he also proves it with the white British characters, the Sholto twins. Maybe Doyle does this to kind of show us that appearances are not always what they appear to be. Maybe he's doing it to kind of allow his readers to question why we would treat people a certain way based on external appearance. Because, as he proves, identical twins kind of prove that appearance is irrelevant. So maybe this is part of his argument and his intent. Now we're coming to the end of this session. The idea of British Empire and others, it's a very challenging idea, so we're just going to kind of recap again some of the key contextual points just to make sure you've got them there for your notes. So as we've said, the British Empire was at its peak. This added fear, whilst it kind of provided great power for Britain, it added fear because it meant that the more control that we had over more countries, the greater the potential for those countries to kind of rebel and to fight back against Britain. So as actually the British Empire grew, so did Victorian fear, ironically. This had already kind of happened once with the Great Indian Mutiny, and it is referred to, a real historical event throughout this story. And as we've said, Doyle forces us to question whether it's right to kind of allow this fear to take hold, because some of the Indian characters in the novella are very loyal and true, others are not. The problem with fear is that it can take over, and Doyle kind of gets us to question whether we should be blaming all others for the actions of a few. So this Great Indian Mutiny is really important. Cesare Lombroso's theory, as we've just this second talked about, also allows us to see that fears can't, the foundation of these fears is not a valid foundation, because it can't be true with the case of identical twins. We can't fear someone on their appearance when actually their appearance doesn't have any weight on the personality that they hold. Now, other additional context points that are really worth noting that we've not already gone through in this PowerPoint are on this slide here. Now, Conan Doyle himself was actually a surgeon who travelled around the world. He was a surgeon on a boat. Now, that would have meant that he'd encountered people from around the world and had greater experiences than everyday Victorians, who most people did not travel extensively in 1890. So actually, maybe it's this first-hand experience that has encouraged Doyle to kind of challenge some of the beliefs held by society and challenge some of the fears. Whilst he doesn't directly challenge them and say that they're completely wrong, he does allow his readers to question those beliefs and the validity of the fears that everyone had. Another thing that you could talk about to kind of support the idea that maybe Conan Doyle was encouraging society to challenge popular beliefs was the fact that he was an advocate of justice, and he had publicly supported people who had been mistreated by society. He supported an Indian man, he supported a German person, people who were not seen as British and might have been feared or treated differently. He has supported them, and he supported them in court, where everyone would see his argument. So maybe, his support of people that others would disregard kind of shows that Conan Doyle was very different to everybody else. He didn't have those same views that just because people are from certain places, they should be treated differently or unfairly or feared. Now, with regards to Conan Doyle's intentions with the presentation of others, it's important to remember that we are not certain of why he creates characters and presents them in the way that he did. All we can use is our knowledge of the context and the writer himself in order to make informed decisions. Now, 3 reasons why he might have presented the others in the way that he did is that perhaps he was trying to challenge the commonly held belief that others deserve fear and less respect than British people. He challenges this by actually showing us the character Tonga, that we see him in a very bad way and fear him, and then when we get to know him, the juxtaposition kind of proves that maybe that was wrong. We also see in some of the Indian characters being utterly faithful and devoted, being treated almost as objects, and then other Indian characters being treated as hellish and animals. It kind of shows us again that we shouldn't always fear and disrespect people just because of the colour of the skin or the way they look. Maybe another reason is that he wanted to actually reveal the importance of judging people on action rather than appearance only, which links to anyone's appearance but race in particular. And he might have also wanted to promote justice and equality for all individuals, regardless of their social constructions that surround them, like race divides, class divides, or gender divides. So these are 3 possible reasons as to why Doyle presented his views in the way that he did through the characters that he did. So well done Year 10, you've now completed the lesson on others and the British Empire. It is a very challenging question, but it's important to consider the reason for some of these characters being included and some of the ideas that Conan Doyle might have been trying to raise in society and the ideas he also might have had. If you have any questions regarding the work, as always, email the teachers and on office teams, and we'll do our best to support you. Thank you.